I'm requesting your identification. This is a security procedure. You're refusing to cooperate. Turn around. Now? Are you screening passengers or screening skin color? The voice shouted, sharp and jarring, stripped of any remaining restraint. A flash of metal caught the light and snapped into place around the wrist of an innocent man. But what they didn't know was that the person they had just handcuffed in the middle of the airport was the direct supervisor of the Strategic Security Division under the Department of Defense. You think justice is built on laws? You think skin color isn't a dividing line? Then watch to the end and find out who truly deserves to be searched. Salt River Airport remained brightly lit at night. Though the crowd had thinned, the electronic boards rotated between departure times and flight cancellations, casting cool-colored streaks across the glass walls. The air conditioning blew gently, brushing the shoulders of a man sitting alone near Gate 13. He wore a white shirt with no tie, holding a black pen as he slowly wrote in a handcrafted leather notebook. Beside him sat a small backpack placed close to his feet. No phone, no headphones, no expression except for focused attention. The overhead lights cast a soft glow on his shirt sleeve, just bright enough not to draw notice, yet enough to make him appear like anyone else. This man did not stand out, not at all. Anyone walking by would have assumed he was a late-night traveler, weary, self-contained, and detached. It was this very unremarkableness that caught the attention of one of the two patrolling officers. They approached from the north corridor, just off their final inspection round. One was tall, with patchy stubble and eyes that swept the area with the muscle memory of someone long in the job. The other was younger, holding a warm plastic coffee cup, occasionally sneaking glances at his watch. They slowed as they neared Gate 13. The older officer paused slightly, his left step falling a half-beat behind. His gaze lingered exactly 2 seconds on the black man's face. Nothing specific, no suspicious behavior, but he stopped, just long enough for his partner to ask quietly, "Something wrong?" He didn't respond immediately, still staring as if trying to recall something unformed in his mind. "Looks like someone," he said, just loud enough for only the two of them. "I've seen that face before. Might be one of the guys on the watch list." The younger officer frowned, glanced over, then shook his head. "Just writing something. Seems normal." The older one didn't look away. His hand had already touched the small radio on his shoulder. Not everything shows in behavior. Some folks act calm, just to cover something up. No one stepped closer at that moment, but the air around the man in the white shirt had shifted. An extended glance held a moment too long. A suspicion formed from nothing concrete, and from that moment on, he was no longer just a regular passenger in their eyes. The man kept writing, never lifting his head, but the pen paused mid-sentence. The tip stayed on the page for another second without moving, as if he had just felt himself being seen through, not by eyes, but by assumption. And that assumption, like so many times before, usually began with one reason: skin color. He remained seated, the final lines in his notebook completed in steady strokes. He closed it, rested it on his lap, adjusted the strap of his backpack slightly, and raised his hand to brush his sleeve as a simple reflex. Just then, footsteps came to a stop in front of him. There was no prior verification, no announcement of identity or typical introductory question. Just a halt, a quick exchange of glances between two uniformed men, then one stepped forward, as if already justified before even approaching. "Identification?" The voice wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried weight. It didn't sound like a question, nor did it carry the tone of a routine request. It was a command, delivered by someone used to receiving compliance as default. The man raised his head. His gaze stayed steady for a few seconds, then slowly moved from the nameplate on the officer's chest to the face turned slightly toward him. That face didn't show tension, but carried a clear expectancy, as if any delay in response would be interpreted negatively. He didn't answer. He didn't do what officers often expected from a passenger picked at random. Instead, he asked a question in return, voice low but firm. "Are you screening passengers or screening skin color?" There was no defiance in the way he spoke. The question held no anger, no challenge. It was posed as a truth he had grown all too familiar with, too many times too plainly, to bother emphasizing. It just needed to be placed there, at the right time, in the right place. The officer paused for half a second. His initial confidence hit a wall, not from resistance, but because the words he had just heard were not part of the script. Grounds for detention? None. Dangerous situation? Not present. Suspicious behavior? Absent. Just a black man sitting and writing and now asking a question he didn't want to answer. "I'm requesting your identification. This is a security procedure," the officer repeated, this time with a harder edge. "What procedure?" The man continued. "What procedure allows you to bypass everyone else just to question someone sitting quietly, drawing no attention?" Nearby passengers began to glance over. A few slowed their steps, instinct warning them that what was unfolding wasn't just a routine check. No voices were raised. No physical tension present, yet the atmosphere had shifted, not because of the scent of danger, but because of the scent of something familiar, the scent that someone was about to be made uncomfortable simply because their existence unsettled others. The officer didn't respond further, but his fingers moved toward his radio. The man's silent resistance, the steadiness in his gaze, and the questions too direct to ignore had shifted the balance of control, and it was that shift, not any specific act, that began to wear on the officer's patience. The man remained seated, back straight, showing no trace of submission. In the silence following his question, something echoed clearly, the absence of a justifiable reason. No explanation had been given. And sometimes it is the absence of a reason that most fully exposes the nature of an act. He was not yelling. He was not challenging authority with volume or aggression. He was simply asking what many had been too afraid or too exhausted to say out loud. And it was that quiet clarity, placed exactly where it could not be brushed aside, that made everything uncomfortable. The officer's grip on control had slipped, not from any violation of order, but from a man's refusal to play along with the narrative silently assigned to him. A narrative that began not with behavior or background, but with skin. The air around Gate 13 thickened abruptly, as if the sliding glass panels had just sealed off all natural airport sounds, leaving only the officer's voice crashing downward. "This is a security procedure. Please present your ID." The tone no longer carried politeness or control. It was a command wrapped in the shell of regulation, a voice coming from a position of power too used to never being questioned. At the right-hand corner, an older woman gently pulled her grandchild's arm and told him to stay still. A catering staff member pushed his food cart by, but instead of continuing as usual, he paused beside a column, eyes turned toward the center of tension. The flight announcement echoed in the background, but no one was truly listening. A young white man in a gray hoodie, seated 2 rows behind, slowly lifted his phone. He said nothing, moved little, simply leaned slightly and began recording. The officer began to feel the weight of attention settling on him. What he had intended as a quick check, perhaps ending with a few warnings or forced compliance, was now confined within a video frame someone else was capturing. And in that frame, he was the one who might have to answer. "We are authorized to inspect anyone showing unusual behavior," he said, this time in a lower voice, though unable to hide the defensive edge. "And you are being uncooperative." The man raised his eyebrows, tilting his head slightly, as if parsing each word to determine whether it accurately described him. No sudden moves, no alarm, no disturbance. And, up to that moment, the only thing he had done was sit still and write. He said nothing further, but that very silence was its form of reply, a pause that forced the other to reconsider what had just been said, and why those very words had pushed everything off its axis. The tension wasn't explosive, it simply thickened, a quiet that didn't need shouting to shake the way people were used to seeing power. And at the center of that shift stood a black man in a white shirt, being asked for identification, as if his existence could not be considered safe unless accompanied by proof. Behind the seats near the boarding gate, a white woman rose to her feet. In her early 40s, wearing jeans and a dark blue coat, she carried a canvas tote printed with a regional airline logo. She wasn't loud or dramatic, but the way she stepped forward caused the entire Gate 13 area to skip a beat. "I'm on the same flight as he is," she said, her voice clear with no need to raise it. "I was sitting here before you arrived. Why didn't you ask me first?" That statement, though brief, shattered the fragile disguise of normalcy the officer had been trying to maintain. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was a question so plain that no one nearby could pretend not to understand. The officer looked at her, momentarily frozen. He wasn't used to being challenged in public, especially not by a white woman, someone who, in the silent assumptions of power, was expected to be a default ally in situations like this. "Step aside, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." The words came out too quickly, without thought, without choice of phrasing. They slipped from his mouth like a reflex, like brushing off an inconvenience that had no place in the logic of authority. But in that instant, what was being dismissed wasn't just a woman who dared to speak. It was the thin boundary between procedure and prejudice, between performing a duty and using power to uphold a bias. The woman did not step back. She stood firm, facing the officer, as if refusing to be excluded from the conversation. Because when someone is asked for identification without a clear reason, then everyone has the right to be concerned. And her refusal to retreat, without arguing, without shouting, but without yielding, did what the entire system fears most. It exposed a deliberate choice. A few passengers began murmuring. The sound of phone cameras being activated could be heard. A younger person, seated a few rows away, reached for their headphones, then stopped, as if what was happening deserved more attention than any call. A gate agent paused mid-signature on a passenger list. These small actions, seemingly unrelated, marked a quiet shift. No one was looking away anymore. The black man still hadn't reached for his wallet, but his eyes paused, just briefly, as if recognizing something rare, kindness that needed no announcement. And in that precise moment, an invisible line had been broken by a question that seemed harmless. "Why didn't you ask me first?" A question aimed at no one in particular, yet powerful enough to push open a door so many had chosen to keep shut. And from that moment on, the airport was no longer a stage reserved for those who give orders. It had become a space where anyone had the right not to stay silent. "You're refusing to cooperate. Turn around." "Now?" The shout rang out. Sharp, sudden, stripped of any remaining restraint. Both the volume and the tone had shifted. It was a command laced with frustration, defensiveness, and the uneasy pressure of needing to prove authority through action. The man remained seated, his hands resting on the closed notebook. He looked up without raising his voice or making any sudden gesture, and simply said, "Don't do this." 3 words. Small and soft, yet they echoed like a stray bell within a system too used to acting before listening. He did not lower his voice out of fear. He wasn't trying to de-escalate. It was a sincere warning, spoken by someone who knew exactly what could happen if power continued to operate without dialogue. The officer did not listen, or no longer wanted to. His face was tense, his eyes darting towards someone recording, which only made his next move more rushed. His right hand reached out, grabbing the man's wrist with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times. It was that stillness that made everything clearer. This was not an attempt to restrain a dangerous suspect, but a demonstration that orders were being followed, even though no reason had yet been established. The man's left wrist was pulled behind his back. The metallic click rang out sharp and cold. A handcuff snapped shut under the white LED light beaming from the flight departure board. The entire act lasted less than 10 seconds. But for those witnessing it, the moment stretched longer than any news segment they had ever seen about public discrimination. A nearby woman raised her hand to her mouth. The child, clinging to her shirt, stepped back in fear. Ordinary sounds, boarding announcements, rolling suitcases, the scanner's beep, faded beneath a silence thicker than the physical space between the 2 figures now standing face to face. One cuffed, the other breathing heavily. The man stood up slowly, without resistance. He didn't look at the officer or the crowd. His gaze settled on the space ahead, where the light struck his back and cast a clear outline of the cuffed wrist. His posture remained upright, shoulders level, unshaken. In that moment, what was truly bound was not his body, but the way the system decided who deserved restraint before understanding who they were. That backward-turned hand, beneath the pale white lights, spoke for everything, not about him, but about how a society can wield authority by reflex, believing no one would be quiet enough to remember every second. The metal clink hadn't lasted a full minute when another sound broke through, this time from the seats behind. Happened to anything. It wasn't a nervous whisper or a cautious murmur, it was a shout, direct, explosive, and raw with emotion. The voice of a middle-aged man, sharpened by fury, rang out clearly through the forced silence. The entire terminal turned instinctively. The phone has already risen higher. Others began recording. The atmosphere cracked, like glass pierced by what people usually chose to ignore. The officer froze. The subtle twitch in his shoulder showed he had felt the shift. This was no longer a matter of controlling the situation. This was now an act being witnessed, and not by people willing to let it pass in silence. The handcuffed man still did not turn around. He did not look at the person who had spoken, offering no glance or reaction. But in his restrained stance, he held his balance. His voice rose, clear in tone, not loud, yet unmistakable to all. I am requesting the immediate presence of the airport's commanding officer. Not a second later, this was not a plea. It was a formal request, spoken with the precision and authority of someone used to working in environments where every word carries weight. The original person recording stepped in closer, panning the camera from the restrained man to the officer's face, then settling on the stunned expressions of security staff standing just beyond the control zone. They exchanged glances. One of them placed a hand on the radio. No words were spoken, but a signal had been sent. The officer who had tightened the cuffs now stood slightly to the side, eyes scanning the area. He said nothing else. The order had not been completed. The control broken not by force, but by the calm silence of the man in front of him, and the intervention of a witness who had stopped tolerating. From a distance, at the entrance to the operations area, a door swung open. The sound of fast footsteps struck the tiled floor, accompanied by the glint of a gold-plated badge. Another man approached, his walk that of someone who needed no introduction and did not come to ask questions. The handcuffed man remained where he was. Though his wrists were restrained, his voice and his gaze stayed exactly where control resides. Perhaps the only thing truly bound in that moment was not his arms, but the rashness of a system now forced to confront its process. And at the center of it all, he continued to stand still, as if that stillness was the strongest act he could choose at that time. Footsteps echoed from the hallway behind. An internal security officer, wearing the emergency coordination team's reflective jacket, ran straight toward Gate 13. Holding a radio, earpiece still in place, he didn't need to ask questions or verify who was involved. Just one look at the scene told him enough. The officer hadn't let go. The cuff was still locked around the man's left wrist. He stood, slightly angled, one hand near his gun, not quite reaching for it, but not entirely at ease either. The tension wasn't verbalized, but anyone with experience could see. Things were slipping out of control. The security officer, breathing hard, raised a hand toward the policeman as if to intervene, but didn't speak in time. The area felt frozen. Everyone watching stayed silent, not out of fear, but from a shared sense that something larger was unfolding. Something they couldn't name yet, but knew had moved far beyond a routine inspection. Slowly and deliberately, the man raised his left wrist. Though the cuff was still locked, the movement was enough to draw every eye to what rested against his bone. A watch. Smooth, pitch black, with no logo, no numbers, just a continuous strip of glass, as if it weren't meant for ordinary people to tell time. He tilted his wrist slightly. A faint blue light activated. That glow alone made the security officer freeze, eyes fixed on the watch as if seeing a signal pulled straight from classified documents. The LED lights overhead still burned, but now they seemed to reflect a second layer of light, one that only specially trained eyes would recognize as a sign of something beyond protocol. What are you wearing?" The officer's voice faltered, hesitation creeping in for the first time. The man didn't respond. He simply held his position, wrist still raised, high enough for the recognition scanner to catch the signal. From the security desk, a strange sound rang out. The operations coordinator pulled out his phone, entered an access code, and stared at the screen. Within 3 seconds, his face turned pale. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone sensed one thing clearly. The watch wasn't just an accessory, and the man wearing it likely had never needed to show ID, at least not here. In an instant, the balance of power bent, not by resistance, not by noise, but by a simple, quiet action from someone presumed easy to control. The light from the watch wasn't bright or blinking like typical alerts. It was a soft blue glow that lasted exactly 2 seconds before settling into a thin outline around the wrist. But that moment froze everything behind Gate 13. The digital boards stopped updating, the ticket printers paused, a few automated gates lit up yellow, signaling authentication disruption. There were no sirens, no emergency tones. Just a synchronized halt, so eerie it felt as if every machine had been programmed to stop when detecting an encryption level beyond standard clearance. The man didn't move. His wrist remained raised, eyes steady, not scanning the room. He knew what had just occurred, and he knew the system had registered his presence with absolute clarity. At the internal coordination desk, the supervisor stared at the central screen. On a dark blue background, a line of text appeared, letter by letter, echo, classified, level, echo. No one spoke, but anyone familiar with the U.S. military clearance system knew that level was never assigned to any civilian. NISA wasn't a company or airport code. It stood for National Defense Command. And level, echo, was a tier no one below federal rank could question. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted not from noise, but from a silence that said too much. It wasn't the chill of indifference, but the frozen shock of realizing every assumption about the man had just been overturned. The officer holding the cuffs froze, his face straining in an instant. His arms seemed to lock up, not from resistance, but from the realization he had just touched someone he never should have. His hand drew back as if the steel cuffs had become something dangerous. Fingers loosened, easing each latch. A small rasp escaped his throat, not quite forming words. As the cuff slipped off the man's wrist, his mouth involuntarily let out a single word: "Shut." In that moment, every axis of power reversed. The man he had labeled suspicious was now someone whose clearance outranked anyone here, and the person just cuffed was no longer the subject of an inspection, but the reason the entire system shut down in seconds. The man rotated his wrist slightly, a calm motion, as if smoothing a wrinkle on his sleeve. No anger, no triumph. He didn't need to say a word. The screen behind had spoken for him, and in that moment, there was nothing the officer could do to take it back. The door from the airport operations wing swung open harder than usual. A man in a dark shirt and tie, reflective badge clipped to his chest, stepped out quickly, followed by 2 flustered coordinators holding digital folders. His stride wasn't meant to impress. It was the pace of someone used to managing situations where there's no room for error. He stopped in the hallway, eyes sweeping over the crowd, then locking onto the officer still standing near the black man who had just been uncuffed. A technician handed him a printed verification pulled from the internal security system. He scanned it, and by the 3rd line, his expression shifted. Not pale, not panicked, but the tension in his brow, pulling tight to his temples, said enough. "Christ," he muttered, not to anyone else, but as if bracing himself against the shock. "Why didn't anyone tell me he was here today?" The man remained still. The glow from the overhead board reflected off the black glass of the watch on his wrist, the blue light gone but its trace lingering like a fingerprint on an order once thought untouchable. "Because I don't need to be announced," he said without hesitation. The answer was simple, yet it made the air feel heavier. Those familiar with the system knew if someone moves without needing clearance, they either outrank the entire process or they're the one who wrote it. Officer Dunley stood nearby, face tight, his breathing shortened. He wiped his brow, then blurted out a defense, as if unable to stop himself, words firing from reflex. It wasn't cooperating. The sentence didn't finish before heads turned, not because of what he said, but how he said it. He, a word that might pass unnoticed in daily life, but here it scraped like a crack across already fractured glass. It wasn't just disrespect. It exposed how one man had seen another. Not as a citizen, not as a passenger, but as a target. The man turned to face Dunleavy for the first time. His eyes held no anger, no contempt, but they carried weight, a stillness shaped by someone who had endured more than necessary just to avoid confronting every insult. I clearly stated my request to call the commanding officer before I was handcuffed, he said evenly, without raising his voice. I didn't refuse to cooperate. I refused to cooperate with the wrong procedure. The airport commander said nothing more. He closed the file and signaled to a staff member behind him. A small meeting was called back to processing. There was no need to request an investigation. The action itself had become evidence, and amid quick footsteps and shifting glances, the black man still stood there, voice steady, head held high. From the moment he said, "I don't need to be announced," everything once assumed to be right had fallen out of place. A slow silence settled over Gate 13. No one spoke, and no further orders came. Only the hum of ceiling fans and the pale light spreading across the polished floor remained. The man stayed upright, shoulders relaxed, hands uncaring of the red marks left by metal cuffs. He didn't need to speak, but this time he chose to break the silence. He tilted his head, eyes locking on the officer who had said he wasn't cooperating. A slight smile passed his lips, not mocking, not bitter, just enough to carry his next words slowly, as if each syllable had been weighed. He, one word, a question that didn't need an answer. No one misunderstood what was being named. Everyone knew what had been exposed was not a procedural error, but the very language, the reflex to label someone as lesser, as undeserving of a proper name. Officer Dunleavy said nothing. He stepped back just slightly, barely visible, but enough to show he was beginning to distance himself from what he had caught. Just then, from the tech counter, a young security staffer in a gray-blue uniform, badge slanted on his shoulder, stood up sharply like he had just remembered something. His eyes scanned the man's face and stopped, widening. "It's him," he said aloud, unable to mask his shock. "The direct supervisor of the Department of Defense Strategic Security Team." The words weren't loud, but they cut cleanly through the frozen air. People stopped moving. Reception staff lowered their eyes to their keyboards. Those recording raised their phones higher, hands slightly trembling. The information was no longer a guess. It wasn't a maybe or possibly. It was now confirmed. The black man, who had been asked for ID and handcuffed at the airport, held high clearance in national defense coordination. Not a standard officer, not an advisor, but the supervisor of a strategic team authorized to suspend civilian protocols in emergencies. The airport commander glanced at the technician, his eyes narrowing. No words were needed, everyone understood. If this was true, it wasn't just a man who had been humiliated. It was the entire security system that had crossed a line it was never meant to touch. The man gave no confirmation, no denial. He simply looked toward the departure board as if time for this was up, and for those who had just heard his name, no explanation was necessary anymore. The entire area froze after the man's identity was confirmed. No one spoke. There were no rolling suitcases, no hurried footsteps often heard near boarding time. Everything stood still, as if a sheet of invisible glass had dropped over the terminal, muting sound and making every movement feel unnecessary. In that silence, a small voice rose, clear and honest, the kind only a child would dare to ask. "Then who should be the one held back, Mom?" The question was loud enough for everyone to hear, but no one turned around. The mother didn't respond right away. She leaned down, gently pulling her child closer, as if searching for a word that wouldn't destroy his faith in justice, yet wasn't dishonest enough to defend what they had just seen. The child kept staring at the man in the white shirt. He didn't know what strategic supervisor meant, or what the blue light on the watch signaled in national security terms. He only knew one thing. A black man who had done nothing wrong had just been handcuffed, and if that was considered normal, that maybe all the lessons about justice he had learned were the only wrong thing. Up front, Officer Dunley began stepping back toward the dim lights, lowering his voice while trying to sound composed. "It was a misidentification. We thought he might be a threat. He didn't respond to the initial request. In a case like that, fast action is necessary." The way he said, "we thought he," revealed that even he could feel the weakness in his explanation. The crowd around him didn't react, but their silence was no longer neutral. It had become the coldest reply to a justification too thin to hold its weight. The airport commander stood upright, hands clasped in front, eyes fixed on the officer who had handcuffed a high-level official without basic verification. Urgent enough to skip reason? The question wasn't just for his subordinate, it was for everyone listening. His voice wasn't loud or harsh, but the restraint in his tone made every word cut sharply through the air. That question, once again, was like a barrier dropping across a road full of moving traffic, a reminder that speed can never replace precision, and urgency, without awareness, is just another name for panic. The officer stayed silent. He couldn't speak. Any excuse would touch what the system always tried to avoid, that people often act not from training, but from being excused too many times for the wrong instincts. The man didn't turn around. He didn't flinch, didn't look for apologies. But even his silence held weight, because he had asked a deeper question than the handcuffs could ever answer. Who's truly dangerous, the one being held, or the one who believes they have the right to hold? He didn't move, only turned his gaze toward the corner where a security camera hung behind dark glass. Without raising his voice, he asked clearly, "Everything's recorded, isn't it?" The words weren't aimed at anyone, yet many flinched. A nearby supervisor rushed to the control panel, where the video system was still recording. No orders, no approvals. The moment had moved beyond protocol. Minutes later, the footage began replaying on a nearby screen. It showed everything: the man writing, the officers approaching, the exchange, the handcuffs, the light, and the commander's arrival. No cuts, no edits. Every detail played back clearly, as if the system itself were now testifying. No one spoke as it played. Every breath, glance, and motion became more visible under the truth. The man had never been a threat. The only one who stayed calm was the one they thought didn't deserve to be silent. Officer Dunley stared blankly at the screen. Each frame rewrote his part in the story, not as the one in charge, but the one being watched. The story had changed. No protest, no voice needed to defend him. The silence, backed by undeniable video, said everything. Now it wasn't the man who had to explain, it was the system. And when the footage ended, no one clapped, no one gasped, but everyone had changed, not because of what they saw, but because they could no longer look away. At the center, the man stood still. This time, the truth had spoken for him. In the small room behind the airport operations area, there was no sound from loudspeakers, no harsh lighting like in the departure zone. Here, the dim yellow fluorescent lights made everything feel older, quieter, heavier. No one leaned back comfortably. No one made small talk. Every breath sounded dry, sharp, like the last note at the end of a late meeting. Dunley sat with his head down, hand trembling slightly as he turned the first page of his report. The pen that came with the file slid between his fingers, as if he could no longer hold on to anything, least of all the explanation he was trying to organize in his mind. The first lines he wrote came out uneven, some slanted, some faint, like the ink had been diluted by the sweat and unease he couldn't hide. Across from him sat a senior officer, not from criminal investigations but from internal coordination, in charge of quality control and ethics. There were no attorneys present, no need to cite regulations. This wasn't a legal inquiry, it was a review of judgment, integrity, and professional awareness. "We're not asking for a defense," the officer said, eyes still fixed on his notes. "We're asking to understand what in your thinking made that action seem justified." Dunley didn't answer right away. He knew that question couldn't be met with words like mistake or procedural error. Those words had lost value the moment the blue light flashed on the man's wrist. From that moment on, any explanation would be measured against the footage the entire system had seen, and no words could erase what eyes had already witnessed. Beside the officer sat a secretary, recording everything at a steady pace, her motions quick, neat, precise. She was young, slim, with short hair and a step tracker on her wrist, not someone who stood out, but whose eyes never strayed from the task. She hadn't spoken since the session began, working like a silent, accurate machine. And in that quiet room, with no noise left to cover mistakes, the silence pressed down harder than any raised voice. Dunley glanced at her, then quickly looked away when her gaze didn't flinch. Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, but a kind of discomfort mixed with unease. She was the one he had mocked in a Monday meeting for mispronouncing the name of a technical report. He had said it loud enough for the whole team to hear, laced with laughter and sarcasm. She hadn't responded, hadn't pushed back, just kept working, and now the one with trembling hands over a report wasn't her, it was him. The room was silent. No one needed to say what had shifted. The quiet no longer came from authority, but from a reversal of roles. The one who used to speak was now writing. The one who had been dismissed now held the pen, recording every word. And though it wasn't revenge, and not formal justice either, it was a moment when the unspoken balance between enforcer and observer had tilted, and was no longer so easily ignored. Dunley set the pen down after the final line of his temporary statement. The ink hadn't dried, but he couldn't write another word. Sweat soaked his collar, his back pressed to the chair, a chill running from the base of his neck down his spine, not from the room's air, but from something deeper. The officer across from him skimmed the report, gave a slight nod, eyes unreadable, as if every line had landed exactly where expected. A faint beep came from a remote device. The monitor lit up, showing a man in a dark blue suit wearing glasses, his voice deep and measured, his voice pronounced with deliberate care. He was the regional ethics advisor, authorized to review conduct and recommend personnel reassignment if needed. He didn't ask why Donnelly had acted that way. Didn't question intent. He asked only one thing. "Do you know who the person you detained was?" "I didn't know who he was," Dunley answered quickly, clinging to the response like a lifeline. It was the sentence he thought might still save him. Not knowing, to him, was a way to avoid deliberate fault. It was the thinnest shield he could raise against what was now closing in. But that answer had no effect. The man on the screen paused, then slowly leaned forward. His tone remained steady, but this time every word sounded as if wrapped in thin glass, sharp and cold. Not knowing is one thing. Believing you had the right to insult is something else. No one in the room spoke. That sentence wasn't just a rebuttal. It drew the line between a forgivable mistake and a dangerous habit turned into instinct. Dunley's ignorance of the man's identity was not an excuse for what the video showed. The real concern wasn't that he failed to recognize someone important. The concern was this: if that man hadn't been important, would anyone have asked questions at all? Under the pale lights of the holding room, that truth emerged clearly, like a black and white frame from an old security tape. There were no remaining contexts to hide behind, no professional protocol to shield the behavior. What remained was a person with a habit of seeing others through a filter, one that decided who deserved respect and who didn't. The secretary kept writing. Her hand never paused, not for a second, but in her eyes, for the first time, there was something beyond detachment, a quiet recognition, not directed at Dunley, but at the system she worked within, that maybe, this time, something wouldn't be so easily forgotten, that maybe, this time, the insult wouldn't be disguised by familiar justifications. And if that shift happened, it wouldn't be because someone powerful spoke up, but because someone once cuffed refused to stay silent. Nothing more needed to be said. The silence that followed wasn't one of avoidance, it was acknowledgement. It settled in the room like a curtain drawn at the end of a long performance, one where no applause was expected, and across every face present, even without agreement, there was one thing understood: names matter. And this man's name was never that guy. The news of the Salt River Airport incident had yet to die down when an internal report leaked, bringing Dunley's name into public view in a way he could no longer avoid. It was a file from the year 2018, when he was still a rookie with the Western Patrol Division. Attached to it was a short, faded note. Frequently selects people of color for random checks above average rate. More specifically, according to internal records at the time, over 90% of his identity checks at public transit points targeted Black or Latino individuals. Not due to suspicious behavior, not due to third-party reports, just his presence alone was enough to trigger his action. The issue had once been reported by a colleague, a young Asian female officer with less than a year in the force. She submitted the data internally, along with a warning. If this is instinct, it needs to be re-examined from the root. But, instead of launching an investigation, leadership followed a familiar path. Dunley received a written warning that was not permanently stored, was called into a private meeting, and then returned to work. The reporting officer, however, was reassigned to another area under the explanation of field-appropriate personnel distribution. The files sank into the archives alongside hundreds of unreleased documents, until now. With the footage at Gate 13 becoming a flashpoint, it resurfaced, this time not just inside the department, but on major news outlets, among civil policy experts, and across forums for those who had experienced similar encounters in silence. One name on the old list, Malik Carter, now a high school teacher in Oregon and once a senior engineering student, posted his story online. He wrote, "I was pulled from my car at a checkpoint for no reason. When I asked why, they said I was obstructing verification. I was struck in the chest with a baton, not hard, but hard enough. I didn't resist. I just didn't respond right away because I was in shock. Afterward, they wrote me up as non-compliant." The officer that day was named Dunley. The final line of his post was what made it go viral. "I was beaten for staying silent. He got promoted." That statement didn't just reopen a personal scar. It drilled straight into the wall that had protected Dunley and those like him for years. This was no longer an isolated incident. No longer a procedural misunderstanding. It was a pattern, systematically unfolding piece by piece, from those who had long been told to stay silent as part of existing. On a special panel discussion, a former inspector overseeing police training remarked, "The frightening part isn't that someone got it wrong. It's when someone gets it wrong and gets promoted for staying quiet. That's no longer a personal error. That's an unwritten policy." Dunley offered no comment to the press. He made no statement after Malik Carter's post. But his silence this time, unlike the silence of those he once detained, spread like a shadow. Quiet, steady, and far too heavy to ignore. And for those once dismissed as statistical outliers, it was confirmation. Some things, once spoken, are never buried again. When major outlets ran the story of the 2018 memo, headlines no longer focused on one man. The question shifted from "Why did Dunley do this?" to "How many like him are still patrolling public spaces every day?" Within 24 hours, multiple investigative reports surfaced across national platforms. The Washington Herald cited Bureau of Justice Statistics data showing that people of color were still 3 times more likely to face arbitrary screening at state-level airports. Meanwhile, an independent research team compared internal disciplinary data from over 60 police departments in the last 10 years and found more than 100 officers repeatedly flagged for racial profiling who were never fired. Many had been promoted after withstanding operational stress. The Sentinel released a 12-page dossier listing cases similar to Dunley's, all quietly closed or deflected from scrutiny. Its headline was chilling: "When Bias Gets a Badge." The question was no longer about who was right or wrong, but what systems allowed injustice to operate while still looking like procedure. A former senior officer, speaking anonymously, told reporters he once saw a colleague stop a group of Black students for not looking local. When he spoke up, he was removed from the main patrol unit. "Not all of us were like that," he said, "but what haunts me is how those who weren't learned to stay silent just to keep their jobs." Online, people shared stories of unfair treatment in airports, parks, highways, and outside schools. Many spoke with calm, not rage, the calm of those too used to proving they meant no harm before being treated as human. As the story spread, the man who had been cuffed at Gate 13 never appeared again. No statements, no posts, no interviews. But his silence wasn't seen as hiding. It became its message: stillness in the face of a storm. People stopped asking who he was. They started asking why someone like him chose to stay quiet while the whole system screamed. A young journalist wrote, "Maybe he stayed silent because, this time, truth didn't need him to speak. It was already clear. And if you need to speak just to prove what everyone sees, maybe the moment for words has passed." Some called his silence the strongest protest, because those who yell often leave less behind than someone who stands still, unapologetic and unmoved. On a weekend show, a political host said, "If this were a trial, he wouldn't need to testify. The system already stepped out and confessed." That quote was shared thousands of times, and each time his name was left out, his anonymity becoming the very thing no one could erase. His silence, oddly, echoed louder than any speech. This time, no one needed to shout. People had already begun to listen, because there was nothing left to deny. 2 days after the incident at Gate 13, national media continued tracking every development. Major networks repeatedly contacted the Department of Defense's representative office, where the man's name had been confirmed as a strategic supervisory officer. They wanted an official response, a statement, a press conference, a soundbite to scroll beneath the screen, but none received an answer. Instead, on the morning of the third day, the internal coordination inbox at Salt River Airport received a short email. No subject line, no signature, just one line: "I do not request punishment. I request acknowledgement." No one mistook the sender. The account used a classified internal access code. But the message carried no tone of authority. It demanded no discipline, no compensation, no apology, and no withdrawal of action from any party, just a quiet sentence confronting what the system often avoids, facing it. A young security staffer on the early shift was the first to open it. He sat silently for a few seconds, rereading the sentence, as if afraid he had misunderstood it. Then, without a word, he copied it and pasted it onto the top left corner of his desktop, right next to the passenger management icon. The sentence didn't incite, but like an aftershock, it began to echo across internal channels. In the morning briefing, coordination teams started referencing it. No instruction, no mandate, yet everyone understood it was no longer possible to hide behind procedural error. That same afternoon, the Airport Coordination Agency issued an internal statement, brief but resolute. "In service of safety, trust, and fairness in public spaces, we commit to an independent investigation, supervised by experts outside the current management system. All abuses of authority, regardless of motive, will be reviewed." For the first time in years, the document did not use the words temporary, under review, or awaiting higher directive. It moved straight to action and transparency. Some in the executive board felt it was a response to public pressure, but most staff believed otherwise. They believed that without that email, without one simple, unavoidable sentence, this too would have been filed away like so many before it, labeled isolated, non-presentation, or worse, handled internally. That sentence, while not accusatory, posed a demand heavier than any verdict to face the truth, not to assign blame, but to recognize what the system had long agreed to ignore, and how silence in the face of that failure had become part of the problem. No speech was held, no podium was raised, but everyone who read that email began to carry a question: do I truly see, or do I just look at what makes me comfortable? And from that one sentence, a ripple began, not with shouting, not with banners, just a quiet reminder, deep enough that this time no one could look away without seeing themselves in it. As the Salt River Airport incident reached national attention, civil rights and legal organizations joined the conversation. One of the country's leading minority rights groups, sent a formal request to the Department of Defense, offering legal representation for the man in question. It wasn't just about restoring dignity. They aimed to turn the event into a landmark case, capable of shaking the system. A strategic legal draft was prepared, supported by statistics and archived footage from dozens of witnesses. Media outlets began discussing a potential class action lawsuit, uniting hundreds who had faced similar treatment under the guise of security procedures. But when representatives tried to contact him, the only response they received was a brief, firm refusal. No longer than the original email he sent to the airport. No formal denial, no explanation, just calm clarity. He would not seek legal representation. The decision surprised lawyers and advocacy groups. Some called it a missed opportunity. Others expressed disappointment, believing he had passed on the chance to change the system through the courts. But when asked why, someone close to him repeated a line that quickly spread across many platforms. If every insult becomes a lawsuit, who has time left to fix the system? That line didn't appear at press conferences or in headlines, but it spread like a small light lit inside the dark space of blame and bureaucracy. He didn't deny he was wronged. He didn't erase what had happened, but he refused to turn it into a personal battle. For him, the goal wasn't to win in court, hear an apology on TV, or get compensation. It was to make the system stop, not to punish, but to examine every distorted gear built from habitual power. And that decision, his refusal, made people view the story not through anger, but through a deeper question. When does the fight for justice stop being personal and start becoming structural? In past years, many lawsuits had ended with clear verdicts and settlements, but afterward, people still asked, what truly changed? How many stayed silent with renewed strength? How many protocols were rewritten? This time, there was no lawsuit, no courtroom. But the system still had to face itself, because the person harmed refused to channel rage into a target. Instead, he placed it on the entire structure that had allowed it to happen. And perhaps that refusal was the strongest legal act of all, not through trial, but by leaving no excuse for anyone to look away. Because if one man can stay silent even in the face of injustice, then no one else has the right to stay blind. Amid the ongoing backlash following revelations about Dunlea's past, another internal document was suddenly leaked, causing equal shock. It was a formal petition dated the year 2020, submitted to the HR office of the unit where Dunlee was then serving. The petition called for his reassignment from the Civilian Patrol Division due to clear bias in the execution of duties and repeated targeting based on personal prejudice. The document was signed by a female officer, then a deputy team lead in the Airport Corridor Control Unit. She outlined 5 specific incidents where Dunlee ignored direct supervisor instructions and independently detained passengers of color. In one case, a Middle Eastern woman was held for nearly 20 minutes simply for traveling alone and looking around too often, despite carrying nothing suspicious. The file was ignored, no internal review, no formal response, just a closed-door meeting where she was subtly advised to cooperate to maintain a stable work environment. 3 weeks later, she resigned. A year after that, her job title on a new resume read only Ride-Share Driver, Platforms A and B. When the petition resurfaced and spread online, reporters quickly tracked her down. She initially declined to comment, but eventually agreed to meet a freelance journalist at a small cafe with no request for anonymity. But she refused to be filmed. She didn't sit like someone seeking justice, nor did she seem bitter. Her face was calm, her voice steady, not dramatic or emotional, just matter-of-fact, as if telling a truth long ignored. "I wasn't fired," she said. "I walked away because I knew I'd be next if I didn't go along with how they picked who to suspect." That single sentence was shared hundreds of thousands of times in one day. It wasn't sensational, it wasn't accusatory, but it struck at the core. In a system where bias is treated as skill, anyone who refuses to bow gets pushed aside. After the interview, 2 former staff members who once worked with Dunlee were identified. Both had filed internal concerns but received no reply. One has since left the field entirely, the other still works in administration but declined to speak to the media. They didn't speak as victims, but as people who once tried to fix the system from within. None were kept long enough to see real change. The former officer, now a full-time driver, doesn't write long posts or join political forums, but her one short sentence sparked a new line in the debate that not only are those being profiled victims, those who saw the wrong and couldn't hold on to the truth were victims too, of a justice system that rewards compliance and tucks truth into drawers never meant to be opened. Her story never made the front page. It didn't become a symbol of inspiration, but it made many ask, in every agency, how many tried to speak and left in silence, not because they were wrong, but because they refused to close their eyes when the system called prejudice procedure. And if they once existed, the question is no longer who pushed them out, but when we lost them, and why it was so easy. Following the former officer's story in the buried petition, journalists expanded their investigation faster than anyone expected. At first, they focused on how internal reports were ignored, but one detail in her account became the key to a door few had ever dared knock on. It was a seemingly harmless note. We have an unofficial list for flagging high-risk passengers, based on instinct, based on experience, but really based on appearance. That line caught immediate attention within the industry. A team of independent reporters, in collaboration with a civil rights watchdog, began collecting testimonies from security staff across airports nationwide. In dozens of anonymous interviews, many admitted they were guided to assess risk not just by behavior, but by secondary factors, a euphemism for skin color, facial features, clothing, and even a passive demeanor. A veteran staffer at Atlanta's Southern Terminal explained that every recruit was trained during shifts with senior officers. In these unofficial sessions, certain unpredictable passenger types were pointed out, mostly Black, Arab, or Latino. "It's not written anywhere," he said, "but everyone knows. It's like stepping in with your right foot at the checkpoint. No one teaches it, but everyone does it." Others shared that when they objected to targeting groups without a specific cause, they were told to trust their professional instinct, or reminded that it's all for passenger safety. Some airports even used handwritten forms to flag passengers worth watching. These were never stored electronically and were cleared daily. No official codes, no direct accountability, yet the results were passed to flow control agents influencing who was filtered out early. From the growing testimonies, the press began assembling a wider picture, a hidden system that sorted passengers by glance, by stereotype, by subjective feeling, quietly operating alongside formal procedures. It survived through the silence of those who saw it, used it, and accepted it as part of the job. No document confirmed any of it. No law, no manual, no training guide ever stated that suspicion could be based on skin or hairstyle. It lived in the gray space between rule and routine, too vague to prosecute, yet clear enough to affect millions each year. One investigative journalist wrote, "We always asked why incidents like Gate 13 happen. Maybe the better question is, why do we still treat them as rare, when the system has allowed them to repeat daily, under eyes trained not to ask?" And that's what made this discovery heavy. It didn't just expose one mistake, it revealed a structure running on selective justice, sustained not by written policy, but by the complete absence of it. Because when nothing is recorded, nothing is reviewed. And that may be the most dangerous part of all. As media followed leads on covert passenger profiling, 4 Stanford data science seniors released an independent study that stunned federal authorities. They weren't investigators, just students, working with 8 years of publicly available complaint data from over 20 U.S. airports. Each entry listed the time of inspection, suspected behavior, officer name, and outcome. They didn't search for reasons, they searched for patterns. Using a machine learning model, they identified more than 37,000 temporary detention cases. Passengers stopped, questioned, and released without formal charges or reports. They analyzed demographics, behavior, and duration. Over 68% involved people of color. Black passengers made up 53%, despite representing just 13% of the national population. At some airports, that rate climbed to 75%, far beyond random chance. In cases involving handcuffs without charges, only 12% were white. 63% were black. White passengers were detained for an average of 13 minutes. Black passengers, 35. The outcome remained the same: no violations. The findings needed no dramatic framing. Each number was a direct blow to the belief that airport security is neutral. The system, long assumed to be technical and unbiased, revealed deep racial disparities through its data. When asked what motivated the project, one student said simply, "We weren't trying to prove anyone wrong. We just wanted to know if what we felt walking through security would show up in the data." That answer, quiet, without outrage, still sent chills, because it was the younger generation, not raised in the era of overt segregation, uncovering a truth once believed to be history, that it still exists, in new forms, quieter now, masked under terms like random screening, heightened security, or operational response. The report was submitted to aviation authorities and the Federal Civil Rights Commission. Even before an official reply, the weight of the data began to press against old excuses. And if anything was clearer than ever, it was this: bias doesn't need to be written to exist. It only needs silence and statistics no one wants to revisit to survive. The students' findings shook not just public opinion, but politics. Less than 1 week after the report spread across major media, a senator from Massachusetts, long known for law enforcement reform bills, formally requested a congressional hearing. At the podium, her voice was steady, not angry, and she named no one. She let the numbers speak. If one person can be cuffed without cause, and if it happens to thousands sharing one race, then this is no longer about individual error. This is a systemic injustice. She called for a federal hearing involving airport representatives, data science experts, former security staff, and especially citizens who had been detained temporarily with no explanation. The goal, she said, was not criminal blame, but to expose how profiling had become a trained reflex, not an accident to be fixed. The statement was praised by civil rights advocates as a first step toward forcing systems to confront themselves without the filter of power. But within 24 hours, a wave of backlash surged, this time from supporters of law enforcement. Across interviews, TV segments, conservative sites, and police forums, one phrase echoed: they're turning officers into villains over a mistake. Opponents argued that being stopped, questioned, or even cuffed without consequences was routine, part of the job, and not something to politicize or weaponize against an entire profession. A former airport security chief said on a televised panel, "If you demand every officer assess each decision through a racial lens, they'll freeze. And when those protecting us freeze, it's the passengers who pay the price." That argument wasn't new. It had been used to resist many reforms before, claiming the system wasn't perfect, but better than nothing. The officers needed protection from public pressure and morale collapse. If everything were seen as racism, eventually no one would dare do the job. But what made this moment different was that, unlike past defenses, most of the public didn't echo those defenses out of habit. More people began asking the harder question: if this is just a mistake, why does it repeat, target the same group, and remain built into the system for years? And if someone is detained for their skin color, why is the one doing it still called by the book? The senator didn't fire back at the critics. She simply posted a short message online, quoting directly from the student report, "You can't call a crack accidental if the house is already tilted." This time, more heads nodded than ever before, not because people had lost faith in law enforcement, but because they were beginning to lose faith that silence would bring change. And in politics, that shift often moves faster than any hearing. Public reaction didn't come from outrage, but from recognition, a quiet sense that the excuse had worn thin. Across forums and town halls, people stopped debating whether the system was broken and started asking how long it had been. The report had made it clear. Injustice didn't need malice to survive. It just needed routine, and enough people willing to look away. The conversation was no longer about proving intentional harm. It became about patterns too consistent to dismiss. The word reform stopped sounding idealistic and started sounding urgent. As more leaders took an interest, it was no longer about a single case, but the rules that allowed it to happen without consequence. By the end of the week, airport agencies across 3 states quietly announced internal audits, not under public pressure, but because they finally realized the cost of ignoring the pattern might be higher than facing it. And that shift, however subtle, might be where true reform begins. Amid public outcry and a flurry of developments after the incident at Gate 13, a silver-gray envelope was found in the internal mailbox of the Justice and Compliance Unit at Salt River Airport. No return address, no name, no postmark. The envelope was thin, holding only one folded A4 sheet. The first line, handwritten in black ink, neither smudged nor bold, read, "I used to work in patrol, and I used to think it was normal." No introduction followed. No emotions were expressed, no apology offered. That opening line stood alone, chilling in its calm, as if the writer wasn't trying to persuade, didn't need context, and only wanted to state a fact once accepted as truth. Beneath it was a list of 7 incidents, not in chronological order, nor by severity. Each case was described in just 4 lines: date, time, location, and situation. But at the end of every entry, one detail repeated like a quiet refrain. The person detained was always a person of color. All incidents occurred at state level or small local airports, places without integrated surveillance, where inspections relied entirely on staff discretion. In one case, an African passenger was detained at a domestic checkpoint in Pine Valley Airport, Utah. He was asked to open his luggage, despite it having passed through the scanner, because he seemed nervous. When he didn't respond immediately, still wearing headphones, he was stopped. According to the note, he didn't resist, just breathed heavily and spoke unclearly. Within 2 minutes, he collapsed from an acute panic attack, later linked to undiagnosed PTSD. He died before the ambulance arrived. The incident was not widely reported. The internal memo only read, "Passenger experienced unexpected medical issue." The letter avoided legal terminology. No accusations, no names, not even the authors. But the tone was steady, unshaken, unhidden. In the final paragraph, the writer added a single line: "I stood by, stayed silent, and learned to call injustice unclear." Upon receiving the letter, the Internal Justice Office immediately cross-referenced stored reports. 5 of the 7 cases were verified. 2 lacked official records, suggesting they may have been handled off-book or never documented at all. Notably, the Pine Valley death matched the date and time of a local news brief reporting a man collapsed after exiting a security checkpoint, with no follow-up coverage. The letter's contents quickly leaked. No one knew who wrote it, but that anonymity only fueled its spread. Many believed the author was a silent witness, someone inside the system who could no longer bear the compromise between keeping the job and keeping a conscience. A journalist commented on primetime TV, "We always search for those who commit wrongs, but this time, the one speaking out is someone who once stayed silent. And painfully, that makes them all the more credible." No one knew why they chose to speak now. Maybe it was the Gate 13 footage. Maybe it was the look in the eyes of the man in cuffs who never bowed his head. Or maybe, after so many times calling things wrong, they just needed one moment where something was finally called by its real name, for themselves. Either way, from one unsigned sheet, truth surfaced again, not as accusation, but as quiet regret. "I used to think it was normal." And when someone inside the system begins to question what they once called procedure, Perhaps the most unnatural thing is how long the silence lasted. After the letter spread and most details were confirmed, delay was no longer an option. An emergency meeting was held within the Federal Aviation Security Investigation Board, and within 48 hours, a decision was made. All temporary detention since the year 2015 would be reviewed, not just at Salt River, but at every facility named in data reports, complaints, whistleblower letters, or independent investigations. This time, the review wouldn't be a routine protocol audit like in years past. A new task force was formed, including representatives from the Department of Transportation, the Department of Justice, and 3 independent civil oversight groups. Any personnel involved in detentions, whether directly, peripherally, or administratively, received an official summons. No one was exempt. No excuses like too busy or no longer employed were accepted. Whether retired, reassigned, or in a new field, they were required to attend hearings or submit legally verified statements, an internal source disclosed. The system has no way out now. If it keeps looking away, the credibility of the national security network will hit rock bottom. Some reacted with anger, others with confusion. But for the first time, a few admitted they had sensed something was wrong, yet didn't know what to do when everyone around them called it just the usual way. The system began to shift. Data was reopened. Recordings, complaints, old camera footage, even forgotten handwritten notes from HR drawers were gathered, like puzzle pieces now forced to fit. No one could brush things aside with "the case was handled" or "no irregularities were recorded," because the irregularities had been recorded, not by one person, but by hundreds of hands, digging through what was once dismissed as unimportant. As the chaos unfolded, the man who had been handcuffed at Gate 13, the man who started it all, remained silent. He gave no interviews, made no TV appearances, joined no forums, and signed no petitions. He did one thing: he stayed quiet. But that silence was no longer a retreat. It became the force that compelled the system to speak, not through justifications, but through action. Each reopened report, each revisited statement, each exposed procedural gap seemed to be answering a question he never voiced, but held in his eyes that day: when will the things that go unrecorded be considered real? Now, at last, the system was learning how to answer, not by rewriting a few sentences in old documents, but by accepting that sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the sign that the moment has arrived when pretending not to know is no longer an option. 3 weeks after the incident exploded, an official announcement from the Federal Aviation Security Office was released Monday morning. Officer Dunley, seen in the video handcuffing the man at Gate 13, was suspended indefinitely pending the results of a full investigation. The statement used familiar administrative language: suspended to ensure transparency, no implication of misconduct, full cooperation with the independent review team, but everyone understood what it meant. For the first time in years, an officer was removed without the system rushing to protect him, and to many, that alone marked a shift. Still, deeper within the system, the reaction wasn't unanimous. Just 3 days later, a group of Dunley's former colleagues gathered privately at a small restaurant outside the city. Some had worked shifts with him. Others had served on passenger flow teams. The meeting wasn't openly defiant, but framed as sharing context and clarifying perspective, another way of trying to regain control over a narrative they felt slipping away. One attendee said, "Dunley was a serious officer. He only did what every one of us was trained to do. If he's wrong, maybe the whole system should be questioned. But why is he the only one suspended?" There was an empty chair that day, reserved for the former deputy commander of the patrol unit, a vocal defender of traditional procedures. No one knew why he didn't come. Only as the meeting neared its end did someone receive an internal memo via email. No title, no intro, just one blunt paragraph that left the room silent. He is not a victim. He is a product of an environment where every deviation was called protocol. No accusations, no emotion, But the sentence drained the air from the room. It voiced what no one wanted to admit. If defending Dunlea meant saying he was just doing what he was trained to do, then the problem wasn't Dunlea alone. It was the system that raised reflex into skill and named it professional. The sender of that memo was someone Dunlea once respected. For years he had trained recruits how to read behavior, keep distance, and make split-second decisions without being wrong. But it seemed even he had reached the edge of what silence could justify. That night the memo leaked. Career forums reposted it, sparking fierce debate. Some were furious, accusing him of breaking team loyalty. Others stayed quiet, perhaps rethinking how they too had become tools of unchecked reflexes. As for Dunlea, internal sources say he offered no response. No statements, no media, no appeal. Perhaps he too understood this was no longer about him and one man in handcuffs. It was the system confronting the shadow of itself. And the question was no longer whether Dunlea was right or wrong. It was how many like him had the system produced and called them doing their job. If he were a product, then maybe it was time to re-examine the assembly, not to place blame, but to decide what doing the right thing means. At the end of a civil rights symposium in Boston, where delegates discussed new training models for airport security personnel, a young journalist approached the man, the one who had once been handcuffed at Gate 13, the one whose silence had made the entire system speak. He attended as an observer, did not speak, did not step on stage, and held no honorary title on the advisory board. He simply sat quietly in the third row, nameless. On the way out, the journalist boldly approached him, no microphone, no cameras pointed his way, and asked a single question, simple and direct, echoing what society itself wanted to know. "Do you think you would have been treated that way if you were white?" The man didn't answer. He looked at the journalist for a moment, did not frown, did not nod, did not walk away. His eyes didn't flinch, but held still long enough for the other to realize that question didn't need an answer from him. It needed one from the very system that made the question possible. He walked away without a word, but days later, in an internal investigation file partially released to the press, there was a brief note labeled M7A, subject informal response. It was not a deposition, not an official statement, just a short paragraph recorded during a closed conversation between him and a member of the investigative team. "I don't care how people define who I am," it read. "My name appears in 2 places, on the assignment list and in the memory of those who saw me being wronged and couldn't step in. No accusation, no challenge." Yet those words struck deeper than any formal charge, because they confirmed something the system never wanted put into words. What happened that day wasn't just a procedural error. It was a moment when many witnessed injustice, but were too used to it to know how to do anything except In the investigation report, the quote wasn't analyzed, no commentary followed, but it was placed at the very beginning, as an anchor to keep the file from drifting into purely legal language, as a reminder that no matter how many procedures get rewritten, what truly lingers is the gaze of those who saw and stayed silent. For the man, that seemed enough. He asked for no compensation, no restoration of honor, no punishment. But the fact that his name lived in the memory of those who had once stood near wrong, and no longer called it normal, was already changed. Quiet, unceremonious, but real. And to him, that was enough for the system, even if it had not collapsed, to finally confront itself, not to decide who was right, but to recognize that silence had run its course. Because if one man standing still was enough to force an entire system to reopen every file it once closed, then clearly what he delivered wasn't retribution. It was a chance to see themselves again, not through cameras, but through memory and conscience. What began as an unwarranted handcuffing at Gate 13 had now become a catalyst for a series of systemic changes, not through a single law, not through a dramatic statement, but through multiple, small, clear actions from places no one expected. One of the earliest responses came from academia. Columbia University, home to a nationally recognized school of public policy and behavioral science, announced a new training program, Racial Reflexes in Civil Procedure. This course was not just for law or public administration students, but was designed as a modular program specifically for security trainees, police. We cannot fix what's wrong if we cannot name what's wrong, one professor on the coordinating board shared. This is not just about awareness, but reflexes. And if someone's reflex can determine someone else's fate, that reflex must be retrained. From the root, the course used real-life situations, including the footage from Gate 13, to place trainees in the roles of the accused, the bystander, and the decision-maker. There were no correct answers, only analysis, why people chose to see risk in one person but not another, and why silence from those nearby often became the crucial link that allowed bias to persist. Meanwhile, the Federal Department of Transportation issued a special directive requiring all airport passenger screening units nationwide to re-examine their passenger selection protocols. This time, operational sensitivity could no longer be used to deny information requests. The metrics were explicitly outlined: screening rates by race, average detainment times, rates leading to official charges, and the number of cases with no documentation. No one was allowed to justify prejudice with the phrase professional instinct anymore. Data once considered internal was now a public benchmark for system integrity. But change did not only come from the government or universities. At a small law office in Chicago, a young attorney, just 2 years into practice, founded a support fund called Gate 13, named for the very place where it all began. The fund did not function as a litigation firm, but as a network for legal and emotional support for those humiliated in public without knowing how to defend themselves. They could be travelers interrogated in terminals, students asked to open bags without cause, or residents stopped in their neighborhoods for looking unfamiliar. Every week, the fund received dozens of emails. Not all needed lawyers. Some just needed someone to listen, to acknowledge, and to say, "You didn't imagine that. It happened, and you have the right to feel hurt." On the office wall, the lawyer had hung a photo of Gate 13. No people, just the space. White lights. A departure board, mid-section. In that small frame, there was nothing remarkable, except a caption beneath. Not because it happened here, but because after that everything started to change from here. No one knew how long Gate 13 would remain in the public's memory. It might one day be altered to avoid recalling an unpleasant truth, but regardless, what the incident left behind was not a place, but a threshold, a moment of impact after which no one could see others the same way again. No one could easily say, "I didn't know." And that, more than anything else, was the true beginning of change. Not from legislation, but from awareness. Not from the top, but from within. Not long after, the Department of Transportation issued a nationwide review of passenger screening procedures, and as reform programs began to take shape at universities and law offices, a small but resounding event occurred inside the administrative wing of Salt River Airport. A seasoned security officer, nearly 8 years into her role overseeing passenger screening, suddenly submitted her resignation. No warning, no farewell gathering. She simply showed up at the start of her shift, knocked 3 times on the operations room door, and left her badge on the table alongside a folded piece of handwritten paper. No one opened it immediately. It wasn't until the shift supervisor noticed the badge glinting under the glass that the paper was unfolded. The handwriting was soft, even, and clear, written in black ink. "I can't bear to choose who gets labeled dangerous just because their skin is darker." There was no anger, no names, but everyone understood what she meant. One teammate quietly folded the note and placed it in their drawer, not to hide it, but to remember it. She never appeared in the press, never gave an interview, never used the letter to call for a movement. But from that moment on, every shift changed. Not because of fewer staff, but because those who stayed began carrying a heavier weight, a quiet question they could no longer dismiss. If it were me today, who would I choose, and why? The media picked up the story from a secondary source. A local paper ran a piece, no image, no real name, referring to her only as the one who refused to bow to routine. The article spread like ink on water, not because it was timely, but because everyone who read it saw a part of themselves in it, the part that had stayed quiet, the part that had gone along, the part that believed things would pass if they didn't get involved. Amid all the stories, the man who had been handcuffed that day never once appeared on camera. No official photo of him appeared in any report. No behind-the-scenes footage, no candid interviews on the street. What the public knew of him was limited to the look in his eyes during the handcuffing, the one sentence quoted in the investigation files, and the quiet presence that had forced doors open without him ever knocking. Perhaps that is why no one forgets him. He didn't become a symbol. He didn't choose to be a victim. He simply didn't disappear, and through that unwavering silence, he made the entire system reconsider not to bow its head, but to realize that once there was someone who didn't resist, didn't fight back, and still made the machine rewrite the way it defined justice. In a world where everything is so easily labeled and forgotten, perhaps the most powerful act is not to stand in the crowd and demand recognition, but to say nothing and still be remembered, not by medals, but by memory, because once memory is touched, it never returns to where it used to be. On Monday morning, amid routine emails and reports, the Salt River Airport Security Coordination Office received a small envelope, childlike in style, with uneven handwriting and 3 dinosaur stamps in the corner. The sender did not include a full name, only Maxwell, Class 4B. The letter was opened by Clara, an office worker who usually screened physical mail before archiving it. Clara didn't expect to cry on a Monday, but after reading the first line, her eyes blurred before she reached the last. The letter read, "If that was my dad, I would scream loud." But why didn't anyone scream? Just a single question. No blame, no description of the incident, no talk of justice or politics. But it struck where no statistic, no video, and no hearing ever could. Silence, and the quiet complicity that came with it. Clara handed the letter to her department head. No one spoke during that morning's meeting, but when they returned to their desks, many paused a little longer at the corner of their workspace, as if the handwriting of a child had made them reconsider how they viewed adult silence. The letter quickly circulated and was later brought up in a staff training session. One female officer, who had been present during the Gate 13 incident, she hadn't intervened, hadn't spoken up. She stood just a few steps away and later wrote the official report. No escalation beyond standard control. After the session, she went directly to HR and requested a transfer. She didn't resign. She didn't ask for protection. She simply asked to be reassigned away from passenger-facing duties. In the reason field, she wrote, "I stayed quiet because I was afraid of getting the procedure wrong, but now I'm more afraid of staying that way forever." The form wasn't dramatic or demanding, but those who read it understood not everyone who stays silent wants to. Some are afraid of making a mistake, afraid of being reprimanded, afraid of being pushed out of a system they've committed their youth to. But if that fear isn't named, it will always hide something far worse. The day they no longer feel anything when witnessing injustice in plain sight. In the days that followed, many airport staff began rewriting their operational reports in a different tone. Fewer instances of based on personal assessment, more detailed notes on the situation, the passenger's expressions, and the officer's hesitation. Internal recordings sounded less mechanical. A few proposed adding an extra step before enforcing restraints, not because the rules changed, but because they had. And as for the child named Maxwell, no one knows who he is. No return address, no parent contact. But his letter was printed and pinned to the security team's break room board, right next to another piece of paper, a handwritten note from the officer who asked to be reassigned. 2 pieces of paper, one from a child, one from someone who once stayed silent, sat side by side, as if answering the opening question, why didn't anyone scream? Maybe because a scream doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it arrives late, through a line of ink, through a resignation form, through the eyes of someone who reads and cannot ignore it anymore. And that too, is a beginning, not of punishment, but of a reminder that you don't always need to scream to be heard. After her transfer away from frontline duty was approved, the officer who witnessed the Gate 13 incident didn't leave the job like many others had. She didn't walk away or search for a lighter role to escape pressure. Instead, she requested to join a newly formed internal reform unit focused on researching and training nonviolent responses in civil interactions. Her new role came without a shiny badge, without a holstered weapon or urgent calls over the radio. Now, she stood in training rooms, facing younger officers, using her own experience to ask, what makes us act before we speak? During a trial training session, she played the video of the Gate 13 incident, but this time she told the trainees to mute the sound. Watch it again with no dialogue, no shouting, no crowd noise. Only movement, only gestures, only eyes. Now, she said, tell me who here feels short of breath watching this, who wanted to say something but didn't know what to say. A few hands rose, some looked down, and then she shared her own story, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as someone who once stayed silent, believing it was the right thing to do. I didn't act, I didn't cuff anyone, but I didn't stop it either, she said, and worse, I didn't think I had the right to. From that experience, the training program shaped its core principle. No one is born indifferent, but if trained wrong, indifference can become a tool, and to retrain reflexes, procedures aren't enough. It has to start with awareness. The reform unit introduced new lessons not about tactics, but about empathy. Scenario drills weren't designed to restrain efficiently, but to recognize when listening matters more than acting. Officers learned how to stand still without being helpless, how to say we're listening without reaching for a weapon. She never expected immediate change, but every training session she led, every time someone raised their hand and said, I've done that before, was one small shift, one step in a long journey for the system to see itself as it truly is. Outside the training room, the echo of that old event lingered. The man who had been handcuffed still hadn't appeared publicly. But now, the shift no longer came from him. It came from those who hadn't been cuffed, hadn't been stopped, hadn't been pushed down, but who were waking up on their own. Because sometimes you don't have to be hit, detained, or insulted to feel implicated. Some, like her, had only stood by, and they paid the price in sleepless nights haunted by a question with no answer. If I had said something then, would things have been different? No one had stripped them of their freedom, but they had lost a piece of themselves, and that, quieter than any sentence, might be the deepest form of reckoning a system needs to truly change. Not from the outside, but from within those who once believed, I did nothing wrong because I followed the rules, until they understand that sometimes doing nothing is the worst thing you can do. One late afternoon in mid-month, under the golden shadows of the departure hall, a middle-aged man returned to Salt River Airport, the place that had witnessed an event the entire country had been discussing for weeks. He wasn't a journalist, nor was he someone in the field, just a passenger who happened to be there that day, someone who saw everything from start to finish, someone who said nothing, and since that day he hadn't gone to sleep once, without thinking about how long he had stood still. He walked slowly through the security checkpoint, stopping at the information desk where a young staffer was arranging papers. They exchanged polite glances, and he asked, in a voice that wasn't quite sure, the one who was handcuffed that day, was he trailed off, as if afraid to say more, partly out of fear of being wrong, partly unsure if he even had the right to ask, but the staffer only smiled, a smile that was neither fully warm nor distant, and quietly replied, not allowed to disclose. But he still passes through this gate every month. Nothing more was said. No name, no rank, no reason needed. That answer alone made the passenger pause for a moment, then nod gently, as if that one small piece of information had helped him reconcile something long unsettled inside himself, not to erase the guilt, but to start doing something different with it. Gate 13 now looked no different. The seats were still neatly aligned. The lights are still evenly lit, just like any other day. But at the far end of the corridor, Across from the vending machines, where there used to be a plain white wall, now stood a small glass frame, unlit, without a banner, without any announcement. It was a modest corner, but always clean, always visited. Inside hung a simple plaque, engraved with the words, "Every act of disrespect leaves a mark," and sometimes one person daring not to stay silent is enough to make sure the next doesn't have to. No author name, no agency stamp. The plaque had been installed by the Internal Reform Group as a way to remind all who passed through that space where something unforgettable once happened, that silence is never truly invisible. The man who was handcuffed that day still hadn't appeared before any camera. No speech, no memoir, not a single official photo had been released. But according to the security staff, he still passes through that gate every month, unassuming, never seeking recognition. Some say he still works the same job. Others claim he's been assigned a new mission, but no one can confirm, and maybe no one needs to, because his presence now isn't in his face, it's in the quiet effect he left behind. Someone once said, "Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand in the right place at the right time." Now everyone who passes through Gate 13 feels something shift, even if they can't say why. Some glance at the plaque and move on, others stop longer. Some don't read it at all, but sense something different, like the air itself is reminding them that even a slow, dusty system must eventually face itself. It didn't start with a law, a forum, or a protest. It began with one man who didn't resist, didn't raise his voice, but refused to let disrespect go unchallenged. In a world quick to label everything procedure, sometimes what matters most is someone who dares to stand still, not to be remembered, but so others won't be forced into silence. That's why he doesn't need to be known. He just keeps walking through that gate. And what he leaves behind is quiet enough for others to finally listen. In the weeks after the incident, media and officials focused on reform, policy, training. But what truly changed was more personal. The feeling inside those who were there. No protests, no slogans. Even the harshest critics stopped asking, "Why did that officer do it?" and started asking, "Why didn't I do anything?" One by one, people began to see that injustice doesn't happen far away, it happens right in front of us. A security officer who'd witnessed the event later said, "I used to think if it didn't involve me, I didn't need to react. But now I know silence is a choice. And I chose wrong." He didn't apologize online or post an explanation. He just worked differently. He wrote clearer reports. He asked harder questions, not to protect himself, but to make sure that next time he wouldn't regret staying quiet. In a different wing of the system, the coordination unit began enforcing a new rule. Every instance of detaining someone, no matter how brief, must be accompanied by a clear, documented reason, either in writing or via the electronic system. Vague justifications like gut feeling or noticed suspicious behavior but couldn't describe it were no longer acceptable. If there wasn't a specific reason, no one could be held. If someone was held without cause, it had to be reported as a procedural error. 1 month after the change took effect, Salt River Airport recorded something it hadn't seen in years. Not a single detention occurred without an official reason attached. It wasn't a milestone to celebrate. It was merely a return to what should have been the standard all along. But for those who had once felt helpless watching someone get handcuffed for standing in the wrong place, wearing the wrong color, or simply being quiet at the wrong time, it was proof that even a slow system can eventually. Strangely enough, this shift didn't come from a top-down mandate. No sweeping orders, no surprise audits. It came from people inside the system asking themselves, next time someone is treated unfairly, will I be calm enough not to repeat my silence? And in the way this story spread, not through outrage, but through quiet shame, the change didn't stem from outside pressure. It came from within, from the way each person began looking inward. At Gate 13, the plaque remains. The words haven't changed. It's still just a small corner in a vast hallway. But more and more people pause there, not to take photos, but to reflect on something they once overlooked. The man from that day has still never spoken publicly, but no one asks him to anymore, because everything that needed saying has already been spoken by those who used to stay silent, but not through statements, through action. And this time it's not about reflexes rooted in habit. It's about the reflex of a system slowly learning to ask itself, how long have we stayed silent, and how much longer can we afford to be? The hearing took place in a white hall on the 12th floor of the Federal Transportation Committee. Outside, a screen displayed the title, Re-Evaluating Public Area Passenger Handling Procedures. It sounded dry, but everyone inside knew this was about what happened at Gate 13. The room was orderly and quiet. Rows of blue chairs lined up perfectly. At the front, microphones and screens stood ready. Dozens of recorders captured every word. The silence wasn't empty. It carried the weight of knowing everything said might come back later. The man who had been handcuffed wasn't on the list of speakers. He didn't attend. Though some had seen him quietly walk through Gate 13 each month, he never stepped onto a stage, not even the one built on what he set in motion. Procedures were reviewed, data was presented, officials and experts gave statements, all proper, all routine. Then a young officer stepped forward. No high rank, no slideshow, just a single printed page. A copy of the internal report from Salt River. Her voice was steady. I won't speak about policy. I don't have the experience, but I want to read a line I think matters. She looked up. Not everyone needs to be remembered by name. Just don't forget what they once carried. That sentence came from a quiet memo written by the man himself. It wasn't for recognition, just not to let the truth be buried again. The young officer folded the paper and left the podium. No appeal, no applause. But in her silence was something deeper, a sign that change doesn't need heroes. It just needs people willing to stop pretending they don't see. That day in the hearing room, where many had come expecting to defend the system, they found themselves facing a quiet mirror, reflecting not words, but the silent resolve of a man once handcuffed who simply didn't turn away. The session continued as scheduled, but from that moment, no one could mention the incident without discomfort. No one reread the report without pausing. Because if silence can leave anything behind, it is unease, enough to make those who once believed silence meant nothing begin to question everything. That's how he changed things, not by appearing, but by refusing to disappear. Within 24 hours of the hearing, the line read aloud by the young officer spread across social media, professional forums, and news editorials. No one knew who first posted it. Maybe someone present at the hearing, or maybe it was pulled from the transcript, but from that moment, the words took on a life of their own, separate from the one who wrote them, entering public discourse in a way no one could control. Not everyone needs to be remembered by name. Just don't forget what they once carried. The quote was printed on bulletin boards in airports, on the covers of training manuals, and cited in ethics courses. Some people used it in their email signatures or pinned it behind their desks, a silent reminder his name was never attached. He never wanted to become a symbol. While the quote lived on as quiet wisdom, the man who had once been handcuffed never reappeared. No interviews, no official statements, no conferences, no photos at reform events. It was as if he showed up once, said what needed to be said, and then stepped back into the very space he had opened. Some said he was transferred to a Defense Department task force. Others claimed he had taken unpaid leave and moved to a distant state. No one could confirm anything. Strangely, no one tried. By then, people understood. He didn't need to be present to be felt. The story didn't need a face to be remembered, and his name didn't have to be etched in gold to shift how a community began to look at each other. Slower, more carefully, and with less judgment. At Salt River Airport, Gate 13 still bears no name. The small glass plaque still hangs in the hallway corner, its inscription unchanged. But people have started to notice something different in the way security officers speak to passengers, the way they explain screening procedures, and especially in how they meet the eyes of those asked to stop. No more weary, detached, or defensive glances. Instead, a slower gaze, as if each person is quietly making sure they don't repeat a once wrong reflection. A night shift officer wrote in an internal log, "I used to think one person couldn't change anything, but it turns out one person doesn't have to change everything. They just need to make it impossible for others to look away, and that's enough to make the system start over." His name, quite literally, was never recorded in any formal reports that followed, but his story became the introduction and ethics briefings for new hires. They didn't call it an incident. They called it a marker, because a marker doesn't need to shine, it only needs to be impossible to ignore. And perhaps what set him apart wasn't that he resisted, but that he didn't resist and didn't submit either. He didn't threaten to sue, didn't shout, didn't try to win. He just stood still, then walked away, carrying everything that had been a wound, while leaving behind everything that needed to be faced. In a society that once believed change required noise, he proved that sometimes the right silence at the right time can shift an entire way of thinking, not because it was loud, but because it was timely. And so, wherever he is, whatever title he holds, his name remains here. Not carved in stone, not broadcast, not glorified, but present, quietly and persistently, in the way people have started choosing how to treat one another. It was a day like any other. Late sunlight stretched across the white stone floor of Salt River Airport. The stream of travelers flowed steadily through security gates. Announcements played on schedule, and the coffee counter near the domestic terminal still had its usual line. No one noticed the man. No one stopped to whisper his name, and perhaps that was exactly how he wanted it, to appear as just another passenger, leaving no long shadow behind. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was a boy, maybe 8 years old, holding his father's hand, eyes scanning the world as if it were still a story, unfolding page by page. The two walked slowly down the corridor, the boy's small backpack bouncing behind him, while the father moved with a quiet steadiness, not hurried, not slow, but anchored. Near Gate 13, the site of a moment no one wanted to recall aloud, the boy suddenly looked up at a small plaque in the corner, framed in glass, where familiar words still quietly lingered. The air-conditioning breeze was gentle, the lighting soft but sharp enough to bring the message into full view. Every act of harm leaves a trace, and sometimes one person daring not to be silent is enough to keep others from being forced into silence. The boy tugged his father's hand, looking up. Did something happen here? He stopped, looking down at his son, then toward the plaque. A moment passed, as if he wasn't weighing what to say, but what to preserve. Just beneath that frame, a new sign had been added. Security procedures have been revised. Passengers now have the right to an immediate response. The line was understated, not a bold declaration, but it stood as quiet proof that something had shifted, not to erase the past, but to prevent its repetition. The man bent down, adjusted the boy's backpack strap, and said gently, "Someone was treated unfairly here once, and no one around spoke up." The boy's eyes widened. "Did you see it?" The man nodded, just enough for someone truly listening to notice. He didn't say he was the man in the story. He didn't have to, because the point was never who the story was about, but what it taught those who came after. "Does that still happen?" the boy asked. The man looked back at the plaque once more, then nodded again. "Less now, because more people have learned not to look away." The answer wasn't overly hopeful, nor did it hide the truth. It was simply real enough to let a child walk forward, and true enough to remind a system that it cannot repeat itself without feeling the weight of regret. They walked past the gate, toward the boarding area. The boy didn't ask anything else, but glanced back now and then, toward that small sign, unnamed, faceless, undated, carrying a quiet imprint of something that had once happened. And maybe that was the true legacy of the story. It wasn't in speeches or printed books. It lived in the way a child's single question made adults pause and remember what they had forgotten, in how a man, without naming himself, left behind something powerful enough to change how a system listens. Things are different now. People walking past Gate 13 know once silence was broken, not by shouting, but by someone standing still at just the right time. That truth remains. Every time someone stops and asks, "Did something happen here?" The father and son walked slowly through the corridor. The rush of footsteps around them didn't break the quiet space between them, a space shaped by a question just asked and something the father wasn't yet ready to answer. Near gate 13, the man stopped again. He didn't look at the child or the plaque. He simply paused, as if the moment needed a truth spoken before they moved on. He said softly, "Someone was handcuffed here, and people thought no one noticed. No drama. No explanation. Just a sentence light enough for a child, but heavy enough to last." The boy tightened his grip. Not just affection, an instinctive reaction to something unclear, but deeply human. A sense that something wrong had happened here, and the right response was not to forget. They walked on. The father's steps are firmer now, the boy walking close. They carried a piece of the story, not to retell, but to hold. Around them, everything continued as normal. Passengers reading, sleeping, moving. But since that day, nothing in that space was quite the same. Anyone walking through that area now has a chance to ask, "If I had been there, what would I have done? And if I see it tomorrow, will I step forward, not to confront, but to stand with someone?" The man sat with his son. The boy colored, unaware of the weight beside him. But the father kept watching, quietly, with the eyes of someone who knew. Sometimes you're not just watching the story, you are part of it. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. The man nodded gently to his son. They stood, and as they crossed the final line toward the gate, he glanced back, not to ensure everything was safe, but to make sure that from this point forward, he was no longer the only one who remembered. What had happened at gate 13 was no longer an incident, it was a marker, a subtle turning point. Strong enough to push the system to recalibrate, not through revolt, not with a striking symbol, but because someone once stood still, and because a child was curious enough to ask, quiet enough to notice. Some stories don't need to be retold out loud. They live in a father's eyes, in the silent grip of a child's hand, and in the way a new generation walks through a space once filled with silence, with the clear understanding that even the smallest things, when truly seen, can reshape an entire era. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, with the small plaque still in place, no name, no date, something had been remembered, not written into books, not marked by symbols, but present, quietly and unmistakably, in the fact that the child didn't ask again because he had understood the most important thing. Something happened. And this time, people noticed. Inside a small training room at Salt River Airport's operations wing, the morning session for internal instructors began like usual. White lights, glass board, rows of chairs, neatly stacked materials. But no one in the room saw it as routine anymore. Since the Gate 13 incident, training had shifted. It wasn't just about protocol updates or lessons on passengers' right to respond, but about retraining the instructors themselves, those tasked not only with teaching skills, but carrying the ethical weight of how we see people, not as targets, but as human beings. The session began with one question, written plainly on the board. If you see something wrong but no harm has happened yet, what do you do? The instructor didn't explain further. He turned to face the 10 officers in the room. Veterans, training leads, those who had shaped generations of recruits. A gray-hailed man on the front row, 2 decades in the role, paused. For once, none of the usual answers fit. Wait for confirmation. Report to command. Not enough evidence. Because this question wasn't about rules. It was about conscience. A younger woman on the left, once assistant lead for tactical training, spoke softly. I'd keep watching. But if I saw bias, I'd step in, even if nothing's happened yet. And if someone turns and asks, why did you target me? The instructor asked. She paused. I'd rather explain why I stepped in too early than why I stayed quiet too long. The room went quiet. That kind of silence that makes people wonder why they hadn't thought of it themselves. The instructor said nothing. He switched the slide. A short clip played. Not the handcuffing, not the crowd, but the moment just before, where a young officer stood 10 meters away, saw what was unfolding, and turned away. He didn't break protocol, the instructor said. Didn't say a word, didn't lay a hand on anyone, but he turned away. A trainee said, because nothing had happened yet. Exactly, the instructor nodded. Nothing had happened yet, but if you see a fist clench, a voice rise, a look flash with bias, and you still wait, what does that make you? This time, no one answered, but a shift had occurred. It wasn't about memorizing new steps. It was about deciding who they wanted to be before something happened. That day's training wasn't designed to check the box. It was meant to create a pause, a space where instructors began to reevaluate how they had trained others for years. Too much technique, too little taught about listening to one's instincts when those instincts speak from conscience, not from a manual. The man that day, the instructor continued, didn't need anyone to defend him. He didn't shout. He didn't protest. He simply stayed silent. And in that silence, he left behind a question that never grows old. If I had been there, what would I have done? The session ended without a test. Each attendee received a blank sheet of paper, no prompt, only one line printed in the top left corner. If you see something wrong but no harm has happened yet, what do you do? Just a plain piece of paper. But it was folded and kept like the hardest test anyone in security would ever face, not inside a classroom but out there, in the hallways, where people are seen not through scanners but through eye contact and trust, or the lack of it. As the class prepared to leave, the instructor quietly placed a copy of the Gate 13 incident report on the center table. It wasn't marked confidential, no redactions, just a plain document. But at the bottom of the last page, among rows of signatures, a single handwritten line had been underlined. Not a statement, not a defense. Just one sentence, attached after a closed-door meeting between the witness and the investigation team. I didn't turn away, not because I'm a hero, but because I once saw the right thing come 1 second too late, and the entire system paid the price. No explanation was needed, no embellishment, but the room went still. Because everyone there, at least once in their career, had been given a chance to step in, and hadn't, not out of indifference, but because no one had taught them how to stop in time. That report was never framed on a wall. It wasn't included in any official training materials, but it was reread in every training cycle afterward, as part of a new ethical reflection segment, not graded, not memorized, only meant to be felt. And then, something strange happened. Though no one in the incident received a medal, no one stood on stage with flowers, and no one gave a speech to thunderous applause, it was the absence of all those ceremonies that made the story last even longer. Because it was never built up as a legend, it needed no climax, no hero move, no tale of the good triumphing over the bad. Just a man, once handcuffed in the middle of an airport, who didn't scream, didn't ask for anything, except that people stopped calling injustice standard procedure. No medal bears his name, no commemorative coin hangs from anyone's chest. Yet months later, fragments of his story quietly slipped into everything. Lectures in training rooms, questions on assessment forms, and the brief pause a young officer took before deciding who to stop. That's what made the story endure. Not as a symbol to be protected, but as a small mirror in which each person could glimpse themselves. Not to redraw the image of someone noble, but to ask, had I ever turned away simply because nothing serious had happened yet? Because if each of those moments were held on to, the moments when someone chose not to turn away, not for credit, not for discipline, but simply because they didn't want to regret it again, then the system wouldn't need anyone to teach ethics. It would relearn them on its own, through memory alone. And maybe that's why this story outlived the limits of a headline. It wasn't a myth written to inspire. It was the truth, a truth once overlooked, once excused by protocol, once hidden behind the idea that it wasn't that serious. But this time, it wasn't forgotten. It wasn't erased. It stood there, not with shouting, but in a quiet, final note at the end of a report. I didn't turn away. And that was enough, not to change the world, but to help a world growing numb remember this. Sometimes, justice doesn't begin with something grand. It begins with someone choosing to stop, right when everyone else keeps walking past. At the internal training office of Salt River Airport, a young employee sat at the far corner desk, where sunlight only slanted through the window during early mornings. He held no senior position, never spoke at year-end meetings, and hadn't participated in any official reform programs. But inside his file drawer, among training materials and procedural templates, there was one item not issued by the system: a printed summary of the incident that occurred at Gate 13. It wasn't the full classified report, nor was it a media release. Just a short excerpt, snippets of testimony, and the personal note written by the man who had once been handcuffed there. He folded the paper and tucked it into the back cover of the security handbook every officer carried on duty. No marks, no annotations, just quietly kept, like a private document no one required, but that he felt necessary to carry. He never told anyone, never boasted, never brought it up during conversations about reform or past lessons, and when asked what the most important document he always carried was, he'd shrug and say, probably the emergency flow chart. That answer was true, but not the whole truth. Occasionally, during training sessions for new interns, he was assigned to introduce tactical response thinking. It wasn't a section with quizzes or memorized stats, but it demanded something textbooks couldn't teach: the real feeling of working in a public space, where every decision was not just a task, but a moral choice. One day, after a training session, a law school senior interning there asked him, "How do you know who looks suspicious?" That question, on any other day in the past, might have been answered with a textbook phrase: watch for odd behavior. Focus on non-cooperative individuals. Notice eyes, posture, expressions. But that day, he looked at the student for a long moment and simply said, "Don't let what feels familiar decide who gets called strange." The student looked puzzled, but the group went quiet. A few wrote it down, a few nodded, and the rest sat still, as if they had just heard something not part of the class, but something that would stay with them longer than any protocol metric ever would. The truth is, those who are most often suspected aren't always doing something wrong. They're just different. Different skin color, different language, different ways of standing in line. And in a system fueled by habit, that difference alone is easily labeled suspicious. The young employee didn't preach. He didn't cite statistics. He simply conveyed, through his manner, that the most dangerous thing in this profession isn't when mistakes happen, but when people believe they're always right just because they've grown used to an old reflex. And in the last pocket of the handbook he still carried, the printed summary of the Gate 13 incident remained. The edges were slightly crumpled, the ink no longer sharp, but the excerpt on the final page was still clear enough to read if anyone happened to open it. "I'm not a hero. I once saw the right thing happen a second too late, and it made the whole system pay the price." He never needed to be remembered, nor did he believe he was preserving a legacy, but whenever someone asked, "How do you know who's suspicious?" he gave the same answer: quiet, untheatrical, but enough to linger in the listener's mind long after class was over. And in that way, even without being part of a reform committee or an investigation team, even as one unnamed employee among hundreds, he contributed to change. Not by rewriting policy, but by keeping the one question that mattered: how do I keep myself from becoming someone who looks but doesn't see? Sometimes, all it takes is one person like that, who doesn't lecture, doesn't raise their voice, doesn't wear a badge, to make sure the things once overlooked no longer stay overlooked. That afternoon, light rain fell outside the terminal, droplets streaking across the wide glass panels of Salt River Airport. Inside, passengers moved steadily, luggage in tow, eyes on the flight boards. Everything seemed the same: orderly, efficient, not a sound out of place. But at exit 3, where passengers leave the security area toward the taxi and shuttle zone, a small new detail had been added just the day before. No announcement, no unveiling ceremony, just a new stainless steel plaque mounted on the wall to the right of the door. At eye level, the plaque was simple, silver, with clean etched letters. Justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be on time. No one was required to stop. No signs pointed it out, but those who paused long enough could sense something different. It didn't name anyone or reference any case, but for those who remembered Gate 13, where silence was broken by a man who neither fought nor bowed, the message held weight. An older guard passed it daily. He didn't think about past mistakes, only the chance to do better now. Some walked by without looking. On rainy days, condensation dulled the words. But by morning, the plaque was always clean. No one was assigned. Someone always did it. Not out of fear or duty, but from a new habit, quietly owning responsibility without needing credit. One evening, a trainee paused at the plaque. The supervisor stood beside him, didn't explain, just said, "The first person," didn't turn away. The second doesn't need to be a hero, just follow. It wasn't in any manual, but it stuck. Shift after shift, new faces, late hours. Somewhere, someone remembered, silence isn't the default. And if one person once stood still at the right time, maybe the next will too. This is how justice renews itself, not through headlines, but through small continuities, not through shouts, but through a quiet nod from someone just beginning to understand, reading that plaque, deciding next time they won't stay quiet, and that's enough. Not to change the whole world, but to remind it, justice can begin with one person, standing still exactly when it matters most. There was no ceremony held in honor, no statue erected in the main concourse. Gate 13 remained, silent, like every other part of Salt River Airport, where thousands passed each day, unaware that a moment there had once forced an entire system to change. Time moved on. Old reports were shelved. Those directly involved had since transferred, retired, or returned to private life. But one thing, even now, had not disappeared: memory. Not in headlines, not in official files, but in the way people had started paying more attention to each other, in how a new staffer hesitated before deciding to detain someone, in how the once unremarkable question, "Why that person?" had gained weight in every training session. Someone once asked, after all this, what changed? The unconscious repetition that made bystanders of many bystanders was now broken, and from the fracture in that silence, justice found its place again in daily life, without medals, without speeches. The man who had been handcuffed that day never told his story. He gave no interviews, made no demands to be heard, but in his silence he forced an entire system to voice what it had long avoided: that some mistakes can't be undone, but they can lead to something better after. And from that story, a new generation grew. Those who had never seen it firsthand, but knew clearly. There had been a moment when justice didn't come from handcuffs or commands, but from someone who held on to his dignity in the face of suspicion and cold silence. Some days people will forget. The system may drift. But now there are young people, those who've read the words etched by the exit door, who've been taught this story as part of their training, ready to stop and stand still at the right time. The stainless steel plaque still catches the morning light in the hallway. Justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be on time. And like a quiet echo that follows, if one person once refused to look away, then maybe the next won't either. That is enough, and that pause, someday, will be enough to stop what is wrong before it happens, because justice is not a perfect state. It is a journey sustained by those who refuse to let go, even when no one sees them doing it. And the most beautiful part is, they are still here. Justice is still here, even without anyone calling their names through applause. Even if their lives carry on as though they've never done anything grand, they will always stand on the side of justice. And because of that, The ones who come after can keep walking forward, with eyes that don't look away, with hearts that recognize who needs to be seen. Salt River still welcomes travelers today. Gate 13 remains open. There are no visible signs of what once happened, but the most important things don't need to be marked in material. They live on in how people treat one another, even when they think no one is watching. In the end, justice isn't about how it is declared. It's about the fact that it doesn't disappear. And as long as someone still chooses not to look away, there is hope that what is right will still arrive in time. Under the stark white lights of an airport where everything seems to repeat itself, there was once a moment that forced an entire system to look inward. There was no speech recorded, no villain named, only one person who stood still and refused to let an act of humiliation pass, as if it had never happened. That story did not leave behind thunderous echoes, but it continues to travel quietly and deeply through every hesitant nod, every slow handshake, every gaze that no longer brushes past too quickly, because there are truths that, once seen, can no longer be ignored. And sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to pause at the right moment for an entire society to relearn how to truly see one another as human.